former Prime Minister Sir Tony Blair, and whether his influence is set to rise under this new Labour government. Blair's already been in the headlines this week, suggesting that Labour will have to raise taxes by more than £50 billion if they cannot increase productivity, and also asking Britain to embrace, you guessed it, digital ID. So is this a welcome return to the spotlight for a respected former leader, or a very unwelcome blast from the past? Well, joining me to discuss this from Novara Media, Bastani, and the political commentator Dominique Samuels. Evening to you both. Let's start with you, Aaron. You're a left-leaning commentator. You should be presumably delighted to see Tony Blair back in the picture.
Not especially, but the biggest story for me with Tony Blair and the Tony Blair Institute really is the money. So the big problem for me is not necessarily Tony Blair. The big problem is that you have people like Larry Ellison, who's the co-founder of a massive company called Oracle, having given the Tony Blair Institute hundreds of millions of dollars. He's given 100 million, he's going to give another $200 million. And his big thing is health data, AI, and what was Tony Blair talking about this week? AI and data and the NHS. So I think it's important to separate the man from this idea of money in politics and people buying influence and pay to play in politics. We can talk about think tanks and we can talk about lobbyists in British politics. There is nothing, there has never been anything like the Tony Blair Institute when it comes to its scale.
Now, Tony Blair would say my institute is a not-for-profit organisation. Aaron, somehow he's making money. I think he's worth about 60 million quid at least. That's what it will say online. He's certainly the most wealthy former Prime Minister. Should we be worried about that sort of conflict of interest, Dominique? Should there be more transparency about how Tony Blair might profit from some of the ideas that he's proposing?
Well, I think it's clear how he's profited anyway. He's still being given such a persuading voice in UK politics. And to be honest, I don't know why anyone would be surprised that Tony Blair still has influence and will have influence, particularly on this government, because the general direction that we are seeing policy and that we are seeing politics is towards more control through digitalization, through AI, and through things like digital IDs, and things like health passports, which will be another thing that will crop up. Keir Starmer's government is simply more of a palatable face to actually push those agendas forward. So whether or not people like Tony Blair are put at the forefront of these kinds of policies, these decisions have already been made as far as I'm concerned. And did Tony Blair really ever leave government? Because we're still debating over the same issues, and yet policy is still going in one direction, and one that I believe is about more state control. And Tony Blair's even alluded to that, saying that Keir Starmer essentially needs to be more of a CEO, which essentially means he needs to stop listening to people, which I think is a very dangerous comment to make when, we're supposed to be apparently a democracy.
Two interesting points, actually, Aaron, to pick apart there a little bit is, does Keir Starmer know that he is there to enact the will of Tony Blair, I guess is question one. But also question two, I guess, when we talk about this centralisation and this control via digital and technical means, will people not want that? Because there will be some people who really want the state to make decisions for them and not let them have to make those decisions for themselves about, say, their health and what medication they should take.
It's an interesting one. There are many policies which I could go either way on. It depends who's in charge and what they want to do with it. So, for instance, take North Sea oil. I'm opposed to drilling oil and gas in the North Sea. Why? Well, under the Tories, I think they probably would have just wasted it on a bunch of stuff. They probably would have given some tax cuts to some people who I don't necessarily think deserve tax cuts. You could make an argument, say, well, we should be like Norway, invest all of that in renewable technology, housing infrastructure. Those are two separate arguments, and it's very similar with data in the NHS. Personally, I don't trust government in this country to deal with that kind of data in that kind of way. It will be sold on to third parties. Importantly, though, private businesses already have huge, massive amounts of data on all of us. Amazon, Facebook, Google, the supermarket companies, the credit card companies. So I can understand the argument for giving data to the state to help us achieve certain things, but I simply don't trust people like Tony Blair, people like Larry Ellison to use that in a responsible way. And the key here for me is history and precedent. Some people watching and listening may remember the NHS IT upgrades that we saw in the late 1990s throughout the 2000s. That cost £12 billion, money wasted. Campaign groups in 2011 came together, looked at that, and they said, Tony Blair wasn't being malicious. He simply believed everything that the likes of Bill Gates were telling him in terms of what these upgrades would mean for the NHS and service delivery. He wasn't sceptical. And I think the exact same thing is happening now with regards to data and AI.
Maybe he's learnt, Dominique, maybe Tony Blair has learned so much whilst he's not been in the front line of politics about how to run a huge digital data set infrastructure. Maybe, I mean, we're all sort of laughing as we're saying it. I'm trying to be generous to him. In some way, you know, when we saw Tony Blair on stage this week, it was a reminder, wasn't it, of what an amazing communicator he is and how convincing his sales technique is. He's just worlds apart from the communication we see from Sir Keir Starmer, for example.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. And that's the thing. Tony Blair can be really quite hypnotizing when he speaks. And I've no doubt that he really does believe in what he says. You know, he believes his way is right. His dangerous globalist philosophy is the way forward. I obviously disagree with that completely. But, you know, in my view, it doesn't matter who it is. It doesn't matter whether it's Tony Blair or Keir Starmer. These are policies that are coming down the line anyway. The Conservatives would have probably enacted them sooner or later, especially in relation to AI and data, because that is the direction our society is going in. It probably just would have been a bit watered down, essentially. But people like Tony Blair are dangerous, yes, but they're always going to have their influence. They've got enough money too, which is sort of what Aaron said.
This issue of this control of the state, putting your medical records all in one place, people will be listening and go, well, what's the problem with that, Bev? Why is that a problem? It might be really convenient, and you do go to the hospital and they can't access notes that your GP has had. Maybe there is some utility here. I think one of the things I found most chilling, Aaron, was when he talked about being able to see these records and therefore enact preemptive treatment. So working out the AI, working out the profile of that person, what you're most likely to get, and therefore treating you before you've even got something. Again, there'll be those people who say, well, that's sensible. What's your problem?
Well, we're already seeing something actually like that happening. There's been a trial of something called it's effectively, you might call it a liquid biopsy in later life, but in early life, basically you have a newborn child, they have a small blood sample taken away, they have their entire genome sequence, and there's potential health issues or sensitivities that can be pulled up really early. Now, I think with a newborn child, that's a very smart thing to do, personally. But like you say, no, but so for instance, you know, there might be a condition that is really important and you're going to avoid, you know, early years or early months mortality, infant mortality. But I would agree, you don't want a newborn child coming into the world and then you have a doctor saying, yep, there's a 65% chance they're going to need a mastectomy by the time they're 55. That is quite dystopian. So again, we need a broader conversation around this stuff. And I personally don't think that think tanks who are funded by people with a massive vested interest in this stuff being implemented wholesale, I don't think that's the best place to do it, personally.
Dominique?
No, I completely agree with everything he said, really. And I think the dangerous part about that, especially in regards to health, is it takes away an individual's agency to actually decide what's best for their health as well, because we live in a society, as you said, where people are genuinely programmed to believe that they don't know what's best for them. And that's a really important point that I want to make. We are programmed to believe we do not know what's best for us. We're programmed to believe that government and people like Tony Blair know what's best for us. And that's why some people might be accepting towards policies like this. But the reality is we know what's best for us as individuals, and whether it's AI, whether it's government, whether it's politicians, everything they say and push upon us should be taken with an extremely large pinch of salt, in my view.
Yeah, well, Tony Blair is back to stay. He ain't going anywhere, and no doubt we will be analysing his ambitions throughout the next few years, if not months, if not years. Right, Dominique, Aaron, thank you so much for kicking us off this evening.